The Mystery of the Sea. I do not remember what woke me. I had a vague idea that it was a voice, but whether outside the house or within myself, I know not. It was 11 o'clock by my watch when I left the Kilmarnock Arms and took my way across the sand hills, heading for the Hawklaw which stood out boldly in the brilliant moonlight. I followed the devious sheep track amongst the dunes covered with wet, bent grass, every now and again stumbling amongst the rabbit burrows, which in those days honeycombed the sand hills of Cruden Bay. At last I came to the Hawklaw, and, climbing the steep terraced edge near the sea, sat on the top to breathe myself after the climb. The scene was one of exquisite beauty. Its natural loveliness was enhanced by the softness of the full yellow moonlight, which seemed to flood the heavens and the earth alike. To the southeast, the bleak promontory of Whinnyfold stood out stark and black as velvet, and the rocks of the Skares were like black dots in the quivering sea of gold. I arose and went on my way. The tide was far out, and as I stumbled along the rude path above the waste of boulders, I had a feeling that I should be late. I hurried on, crossed the little rill which usually only trickled down beside the fisher's zigzag path at the back of Whinnyfold, but which now was a rushing stream. Again the noise of falling water, the voice of the Lammas floods, and took the cart track which ran hard by the cliff down to the point which looked direct upon the Skares. When I reached the very edge of the cliff, where the long seagrass and the deep clover felt underfoot like a luxurious carpet, I was not surprised to see Gormala seated, looking out seawards. The broad track of moon lay right across the outmost rock of the Skares and falling across some of the jagged rocks, which seemed like fangs rising from the deep water as the heave of the waveless sea fell back and the white water streamed down, came up to where we stood and seemed to bathe both the seer woman and myself in light. There was no current anywhere, but only the silent rise and fall of the water in the everlasting movement of the sea. When she heard me behind her, Gormala turned round, and the patient calmness of her face disappeared. She rose quickly, and as she did so she pointed to a small boat which, sailing up from the south, was now drawing opposite to us, and appeared to be making a course as close to shore as possible, just clearing the outer bulwark of the Skares. "Look," she said, "Lachlan MacLeod comes by his lanes. The rocks are around him, and his doom is at hand." There did not appear any danger in such a course. The wind was gentle, the tide was at the still moment between ebb and flow, and the smoothness of the water beyond the rock seemed to mark its great depth. All at once the boat seemed to stand still. We were too far off to hear a sound even on such a still night. The mast bent forward and broke short off. The sails hung limp in the water, with the peak of the lug sail sticking up in a great triangle, like the fin of a mammoth shark. A few seconds after, a dark speck moved on the water, which became agitated around it. It was evident that a swimmer was making for land. I would have gone to help him had it been of use, but it was not. The outer rock was half a mile away. Indeed, though I knew it was no use, I was yet about to swim to meet him when Gormala's voice behind me arrested me. "Do you not see that gin you meet him amid young rocks? You can, when the tide begins to race, be no help to any. If he can win, though, ye may help him if he may bide here." The advice was good, and I stayed my feet. The swimmer evidently knew the danger, for he hurried frantically to win some point of safety before the tide should turn. But the rocks of the Skares are deadly steep. They rise from the water sheer everywhere, and to climb them from the sea is a hopeless task. Once and again the swimmer tried to find a chink or cranny where he could climb, but each time he tried to raise himself he fell back into the water. Moreover, I could see that he was wounded, for his left hand hung idle. He seemed to realize the hopelessness of the task, and turning, made desperately for the part where he stood. He was now within the most dangerous spot in the whole region of the Skares. The water is of great depth everywhere, and the needle points of rocks rise almost to the very surface. It is only when the waves are rough at low water that they can be seen at all, when the dip of the waves leaves them bare. But from the surface, in calm weather, they cannot be seen, as the swirl of the tide around them is invisible. Here, too, the tide, rounding the point and having the current broken by the masses of the great rock, rolls with inconceivable rapidity. I had too often watched from the headland where my house was to be said of the tide not to know the danger. I shouted as loudly as I could, but for some reason he did not hear me. The moments ere the tide should turn seemed like ages, and yet it was with a sudden shock that I heard the gurgle of moving water, followed by the lap, 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 getting quicker each second. Somewhere inland the clock struck 12. The tide had turned and was beginning to flow. In a few seconds the swimmer felt its effects, though he did not seem to notice them. Then he was swept towards the north. All at once there was a muffled cry which seemed to reach slowly to where we stood, and the swimmer rolled over for an instant. It was only too apparent what had happened. He had struck his arm against one of the sunken rocks and injured it. Then he commenced a mad struggle for life, swimming without either arm in that deadly current which grew faster and faster every moment. He was breathless, and now and again his head dipped, but he kept on valiantly. At last, in one of these dips, borne by the momentum of his own strength and the force of the current, he struck his head against another of the sunken rocks. For an instant he raised it, and I could see it run red in the glare of the moonlight. Then he sank. From the height where I stood I could see the bloody roll over and over in the fierce current which made for the outmost point to the northeast of the promontory. I ran over as fast as I could, Gormala following. When I came to the rock, which here shelved, I plunged in, and after a few strokes met by chance the body as it rolled upward. With a desperate effort I brought it to land. The struggle to lift the body from the water and to bear it up the rock exhausted me, so that when I reached the top of the cliff, I had to pause for a few seconds to breathe hard. Since the poor fellow's struggle for life had begun, I had never for an instant given the prophecy a thought. But now, all at once, as I looked past the figure, lying limp before me with the poor arms twisted unnaturally and the head turned, away past the moonlit sea and the great golden orb whose track was wrinkled over the racing tide, the full force of it burst upon me, and I felt a sort of spiritual transformation. The air seemed full of fluttering wings. Sea and land alike teemed with life that I had not hitherto dreamed of. I fell in a sort of spiritual trance. But the open eyes were upon me. I feared the man was dead, but Britain-like I would not accept the conviction without effort. So I raised the body to my shoulders, determined to make with what speed I could for Whinnyfold, where fire and willing hands could aid in restoration. As I laid the limp body across my shoulders, holding the two hands in my right hand to steady the burden, whilst with the left I drew some of the clothing tight, I caught Gormala's eye. She had not helped me in any possible way, though more than once in distress I had called to her. So now I said angrily, "Get away, woman! You should be ashamed of yourself, never to help at such a time!" And I took my way unaided. I did not heed at the time her answer, spoken with a certain measure of deprecation, though it afterwards came back to me. Am I to work against the fates when they have spoken? The dead are dead, indeed, when the voice has whispered in their ears. Now, as I pass along with the hands of the dead man in mine, the true shell of a man whose spirit could be but little space away, whilst the still blood in the veins was yet warm, a strange thing began to happen. The spirits of the earth and sea and air seemed to take shape to me, and all the myriad sounds of the night to have a sentient cause of utterance. As I panted and struggled on, my physical effort warring equally with the new spiritual experience, so that nothing remained except sentience and memory. I could see Gormala walking abreast me with even steps. Her eyes glared balefully with a fierce disappointment. Never once did she remit the vigilant, keen look which seemed to pierce into my very soul. For a short space of time there was something of antagonism to her, but this died away imperceptibly, and I neither cared nor thought about her, except when my attention would be called to her. I was becoming wrapped in the realization of the mightier forces around me. Just where the laneway from the cliff joins Whinnyfold, there is a steep zigzagging path running down the stony beach far below where the fishers keep their boats, and which is protected from almost the wildest sea by the great black rock, the Codman, which fills the middle of the little bay, leaving deep channels on either hand. When I was coming to this spot, suddenly all the sounds of the night seemed to cease. The very air grew still, so that grasses did not move or rustle, and the waters of the swirling tide ceased to run in grim silence on their course. Even to that inner sense, which was so new to me that the change in everything to which it was susceptible became at once noticeable. All things stood still. It was as though the spirits of earth and air and water were holding their breath for some rare portent. Indeed, I noticed as my eye ranged the surface of the sea that the moon track was for the time no longer rippled, but lay in a broad glistening band. The only living thing in all the wide world, it seemed to me, the figure of Gormala as, with lowering eyes and suspended breath, she stood watching me with uncompromising, persistent sternness. Then my own heart seemed to stand still, to be a part of the grim silence of the waiting forces of the world. I was not frightened. I was not even amazed. All seemed so thoroughly in keeping with the prevailing influence of the time that I did not feel even a moment of surprise. Up the steep path came a silent procession of ghostly figures, so misty of outline that through the grey-green of their phantom being the rocks and moonlit sea were apparent, and even the velvet blackness of the shadows of the rocks did not lose their gloom. And yet each figure was defined so accurately that every feature, every particle of dress or accoutrement could be discerned. Even the sparkle of their eyes in the grim waste of ghostly grey was like the lambent flashes of prophoric light in the foam of moving water cleft by a swift prow. There was no need for me to judge by the historical sequence of their attire, or by any inference of hearing. I knew in my heart that these were the ghosts of the dead who had been drowned in the waters of Cruden Skares. Indeed, the moments of their passing, and they were many, for the line was of sickening length, became to me a lesson of the long flight of time. At the first were skin-clad savages with long wild hair matted, then others with rude primitive clothing, and so on in historic order, men, aye, and here and there a woman too, of many lands, whose garments were of varied cut and substance. Red-haired Vikings, and black-haired Celts, and Phoenicians, fair-haired Saxons, and swarthy Moors in flowing robes. At first the figures, chiefly of the barbarians, were not many, but as the sad procession passed along, I could see how each later year had brought its ever-growing tale of loss and disaster, and added more and faster to the grim harvest of the sea. A vast number of phantoms had passed when there came along a great group which at once attracted my attention. They were all swarthy, and bore themselves proudly under their cuirasses and coats of mail, or their garb as fighting men of the sea. Spaniards they were, I knew from their dress, and of 3 centuries back. For an instant my heart leapt. These were men of great armada, come up from the wreck of some lost galleon or patache to visit once again the glimpse of the moon. They were of lordly mien, with large aquiline features and haughty eyes. As they passed, one of them turned and looked at me, As his eyes lit on me, I saw spring into them as though he were quick dread and hate and fear. Hitherto I had been impressed, awed, by the indifference of the passing ghosts. They had looked nowhere, but with steady, silent, even tread had passed their way. But when this one looked at me, it was a glance from the spirit world which chilled me to the very soul. But he too passed on. I stood at the head of the winding path, having the dead man still on my shoulders, and looking with sinking heart at the sad array of the victims of the Cruden scares. I noticed that most who came now were seamen, with here and there a group of shoresmen and a few women amongst them. The fishermen were many, and without exception they wore great sea boots, and so with what patience I could, I waited for the end. At length it came in the shape of a dim figure of great stature, and both of whose arms hung limp. The blood from a gash on his forehead had streamed on to his golden beard, and the golden eyes looked far away. With a shudder, I saw that this was the ghost of the man whose body, now less warm, lay upon my shoulders. And so I knew that Lachlan MacLeod was dead. I was relieved when I saw that he did not even look at me, though as I moved on, following the procession, he walked beside me with equal steps, stopping and moving as I stopped and moved. The silence of death was upon the little hamlet of Whinnyfold. There was not a sign of life, not a dog barked as the grim procession had moved up the steep path, or now filled across the running stream and moved along the footpath toward Cruden. Gormala, with eager eyes, kept watching me, and as the minutes wore on I began to resume my double action of thought, for I could see in her face that she was trying to reason out my own expression something of what I was looking at. As we moved along, she now began to make suggestions to me in a fierce whisper, evidently hoping that she might learn something from my acquiescence in, or negation of, her thought. Through that ghostly silence, her living voice cut with the harshness of a corncrake, shearing the silence of the night with ragged edge. Perhaps it was for the best. Looking back now on that awful experience, I know that no man can say what his mind may suffer in the aftertime who walks alone with the dead. That I was strung to some amazing pitch was manifested by the fact that I did not seem to feel the great weight which lay upon my shoulders. I have naturally vast strength, and the athletic training of my youth had developed it highly. But the weight of an ordinary man is much to hold or carry for even a short time, and the body which I bore was almost that of a giant. The path across the neck of land which makes the Skares a promontory is flat, with here and there a deep cleft, like a miniature ravine, where the water from the upland rushes in flood time down to the sea. All these rills were now running strong, but I could hear no sound of murmuring water, no splash as the streams leapt over the edge of the cliff on the rocks below in whitening spray. The ghostly procession did not pause at any of these streams, but moved on impassively to the farther side, where the path trends down to the sands of Cruden Bay. Gormala stood a moment watching my eyes as they swept the long line passing the angle, so that I could see them all at once. That she guessed something was evident from her speech. "They are many." His eyes ranged wide. I started, and she knew that she had guessed aright. This one guess seemed to supply her with illimitable data. She evidently knew something of the spirit world, though she could not see into its mysteries. Her next words brought enlightenment to me. "They are human spirits. They follow the path that the feet of man have made." It was so. The procession did not float over the surface of field or sand, but took its painful way down the zigzag of the cliff and over the rocky path, through the great boulders of the foreshore. When the head of it reached the sand, it passed along the summit of the ridge, just as every Sunday night the fishermen of Whinnyfold and Colliston did in returning to their herring boats at Peterhead. The tramp across the sands was long and dreary, often as I had taken that walk in rain or storm, with the wind almost sweeping me off my feet, whilst the sand drift from the bent-covered hills almost cut my cheeks and ears. I had never felt the way to be so long or so hard to travel. Though I did not realize it at the time, the dead man's weight was beginning to tell sorely upon me. Across the bay I could see the few lights in the village of Port Erroll that were to be seen at such a time of night, and far over the water came the cold grey light, which is the sign of the waning of the night rather than of the coming of the morning. When we came to the Hacla, the head of the procession turned inward through the sand hills. Gormala, watching my eyes, saw it, and an extraordinary change came over her. For an instant she was as if stricken, and stood stock still. Then she raised her hands in wonder, and said in an awed whisper, "The Holy Well! They gang to St. Olaf's Well. The Lammas floods will aye serve them well." With an instinct of curiosity strong upon me, I hurried on so as to head the procession. As I moved along the rough path amongst the sand hills, I felt the weight of the burden on my shoulders grow heavier and heavier, so that my feet dragged as do the feet of one in a nightmare. As I moved on, I looked round instinctively and saw that the shade of Lachlan MacLeod no longer kept pace with me, but retained its place in the procession. Gormala's evil eye was once more upon me, but with her diabolical cunning she guessed the secret of my looking round. She moved along not with me, but at the rate she had been going, as though she liked or expected to remain in juxtaposition to the shade of the dead man. Some purpose of her own was to be fulfilled. As I pressed on, the shades around me seemed to grow dimmer and dimmer still, till at last I could see little more than a film or haze. When I came to St. Olaf's Well, then merely a round pool at the base of the high land that stretches back from the Hacla, the ghostly mist was beginning to fade into the water. I stood hard by, and the weight upon my shoulders became dreadful. I could hardly stand. I determined, however, to hold on as long as I could and see what would happen. The dead man, too, was becoming colder. I did not know whether the dimming of the shadows was from this cause, or because the spirit of the man was farther away. It was possibly both, for as the silent, sad procession came on, I could see more distinctly. When the wraith of the Spaniard turned and looked at me, he seemed once more to look with living eyes from a living soul. Then there was a dreary wait, whilst the rest came along and passed in awesome stillness down into the well and disappeared. The weight upon my shoulders now became momentarily more intolerable. At last I could bear it no longer, and half bending I allowed the body to slip to the ground, I only holding the hands to steady the descent. Gormala was now opposite to me, and seeing what I had done, leaped towards me with a loud cry. For one dim moment, the wraith of the dead man stood above its earthly shell, and then I saw the ghostly vision no more. At that instant, just as Gormala was about to touch the dead body, there was a loud hiss and murmur of waters. The pool burst up in a great fountain, scattering sand and water around for a wide space. I rushed back. Gormala did the same. Then the waters receded again, and when I looked, the corpse of Lachlan MacLeod was gone. It was swallowed up in the Holy Well. Overcome with physical weariness and strange horror of the scene, I sank down on the wet sand. The scene whirled round me. I remember no more.